When Clash Royale officially launched in early 2016, the Hog Rider quickly became one of the most infamous cards in the game. Players who had already been familiar with him from Clash of Clans were excited to see this wild hammer-swinging character charging into a brand new battlefield. His design was simple, yet brilliant. He only targeted buildings, which meant he bypassed troops unless they blocked him. On top of that, he could jump over the river, which was a unique mechanic at the time. Suddenly, there was a troop that felt unstoppable when dropped correctly, and it made the game feel both fun and frustrating depending on which side of the hog you were on. In January 2016, Hog Rider was available right from the global release of Clash Royale. It didn't take long before people realized that this 4 elixir card could do massive tower damage in just a few swings. Combine it with some simple support like Ice Spirit or Fireball, and you had a win condition that could shred towers before your opponent even knew what was happening. Players who were new to the game leaned on Hog Rider because it was so direct. Drop him at the bridge and watch him charge. No complicated setups, no huge risk, he just got the job done. Of course, when something is this strong in a competitive game, balance changes are not far behind. Just a month after release in February 2016, Supercell reduced his sight range to 9.5 tiles, which meant he would no longer lock on to buildings as quickly from across the arena. They also updated his voice to separate him from Barbarians since both originally shared the same sound effects. It wasn't a massive nerf, but it showed that Supercell was already paying close attention to how the Hog Rider shaped the meta. The first real hit came in June 2016 when Supercell dropped his damage by 6%. At the time, this was a pretty big deal because it meant Hog Rider could no longer guarantee the same tower damage in those early rushes. Still, the nerf didn't stop him. Players just adjusted, they found new ways to cycle him faster, they combined him with cheaper cards. They realized that even slightly weaker Hog Rider swings were still some of the most reliable damage you could get. What made Hog Rider so polarizing in 2016 was that he felt like the perfect mix of fun and rage-inducing gameplay. If you were the one playing him, you loved his speed and consistency. You knew every push would get you value. But if you were facing him, it felt unfair. He would leap over the river, skip all your carefully placed troop defenses, and smack your tower before you had time to breathe. For new players, it sometimes felt like an impossible card to deal with. Looking back, the early months of Hog Rider set the tone for everything that followed. He established himself as the card you could always trust in your deck. He forced Supercell to think about how a single troop could dominate an entire meta. And he sparked the first wave of community debates about skill. Some players swore Hog Rider was too easy to use and didn't reward strategy. Others argued that knowing how to support him and cycle efficiently was one of the highest skill ceilings in the game. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, but the controversy only added to his legacy. By the end of 2016, Hog Rider had already proven that he wasn't just another card in Clash Royale, he was the card. Whether you loved him or hated him, he defined the early game experience. When you think of those first few months after launch, you can't ignore the impact of that hammer, swinging troop yelling, "Hog Rider," as he charged straight to your tower. Balance changes and meta shifts, 2017 to 2018. By the time 2017 rolled around, Hog Rider had already cemented himself as one of the most important cards in Clash Royale. The initial nerfs in 2016 hadn't slowed him down. In fact, they almost seemed to make him more popular because players realized that even with slight reductions in damage, he was still the most reliable win condition in the game. What followed in the next 2 years was a fascinating period where Hog Rider became not just a card you could throw into any deck, but the centerpiece of entire archetypes that would go on to define Clash Royale history. The most famous of these was the birth of Hog Cycle decks, and more specifically, the legendary 2.6 Hog Cycle. This deck revolved around cheap cards like Ice Spirit Skeleton's Cannon and Ice Golem, all designed to keep the deck rotation extremely fast. The idea was simple. You play Hog Rider and cycle through your cards quickly, and before your opponent even resets, you already have another Hog Rider charging at their tower. This made matches feel suffocating for the defender and exhilarating for the attacker. Suddenly, Hog Rider wasn't just a win condition, he was the engine for an entire playstyle built around speed and efficiency. The 2.6 deck became so iconic that it still gets talked about years later. In 2018, a Japanese player known as Jack actually reached the #1 spot on the global leaderboard using this exact deck. That run cemented 2.6 as one of the most skill-expressive decks in Clash Royale history. For some players, that was proof that Hog Rider wasn't just drop and forget. It showed that if you mastered the cycle mechanics, you could play at the absolute highest level of the game, but at the same time, the controversy never went away. Plenty of players argued that Hog Rider decks were too simple and too forgiving. Even if you misplayed, you could just cycle back to another Hog and eventually get chip damage on the tower. The term drop and forget became a way to mock Hog Rider users. You drop him at the bridge and he does the rest. No need for careful setup or synergy. Of course, players who actually mained Hog decks would laugh at that idea. They would point to the tight elixir management, precise defense, and constant pressure needed to make Hog decks work. The debate about whether Hog Rider was a high skill or low skill card became one of the longest running arguments in the community. Meanwhile, Supercell kept an eye on the situation but chose not to hit Hog Rider with massive nerfs. They understood that Hog Rider was too iconic to gut. Instead, they made smaller balance tweaks around him, or to cards that supported him. This created an interesting dynamic. Every time a new defensive building or spell got adjusted, the community immediately asked, how does this affect Hog? It was a sign of just how central the card had become. Another key shift in this era was the rise of Hog variants. While 2.6 was the poster child, there were countless other Hog decks floating around. Hog Lightning, Hog Freeze, and later Hog EQ all started to gain traction. Each of these gave the archetype a slightly different flavor while still leaning on Hog Rider as the core damage dealer. The variety kept him fresh and prevented the meta from ever feeling completely stale, even if people were still groaning every time they saw Hog at the bridge. For competitive play, this period was the golden age of Hog Rider. He was everywhere in tournaments, from small community events to official Clash Royale League matches. Players knew that bringing a Hog deck was always a safe bet because it had no hard counters. Sure, there were defensive options like Tornado or buildings like Inferno Tower, but nothing truly shut him down forever. Over the course of a game, a good Hog player could almost always squeeze out enough chip damage to stay in the fight. Looking back at 2017 and 2018, you can see why Hog Rider's reputation grew so strong. He wasn't just another troop, he was shaping the entire way people thought about Clash Royale. If you were serious about the game, you either played Hog decks or you learned how to beat them. That was the reality. And for all the frustration it caused, there's something kind of amazing about how 1/4 Elixir card could dominate the attention of both casual and competitive players for years. The funny part is that despite all this talk, Hog Rider was never truly broken in these years. He wasn't an unbeatable card like the old Royal Giant or the infamous Expo stalemates. He was strong, consistent, and versatile, which is maybe the scariest combination of all. That's why even today when people think of Clash Royale's early meta, they don't just remember the big tanks or splash damage spells. They remember the sound of a hammer swinging and that familiar cry of Hog Rida as yet another tower took chip damage it couldn't stop. Competitive play and iconic decks, 2018 to 2020. If the years 2016 and 2017 were about the Hog Rider proving himself, then the stretch between 2018 and 2020 was where he became a true competitive icon. This was the period when Clash Royale esports was at its peak, with the Clash Royale League pulling in top players from all over the world. And in almost every major event, the Hog Rider made an appearance. That says a lot when you consider how many new cards were being added to the game, and how much the meta shifted every few months. The backbone of Hog Rider's success in competitive play was still the legendary 2.6 Hog Cycle deck. In December 2017, a balance update for the game Clash Royale slowed the Hog Rider's hit speed from 1.5 to 1.6 seconds, a change referred to as a nerf or a small nerf. This change also made its first attack 0.1 seconds slower. The update went live on December 12, 2017. By 2018, the deck had already cemented its reputation as one of the highest skill decks in Clash Royale. It demanded perfect timing and razor-sharp elixir management, unlike heavier decks like Golem or Lava Loon. 2.6 punish mistakes brutally. Miss one cannon placement against a push or cycle one card too late, and the whole game could slip away. But if you mastered it, the deck rewarded you with consistent results against almost any opponent. The competitive scene gave 2.6 some of its biggest moments. Players like Jack continued to dominate the ladder with Hog decks, and in professional matches, Hog Cycle became the reliable go-to strategy. For teams competing in CRL, it was almost mandatory to have one player who specialized in Hog. It wasn't flashy like Graveyard or as overwhelming as Three Musketeers, but it was dependable. In a high-pressure, best-of-3 set, a strong Hog deck could swing the momentum completely. But Hog Rider wasn't just limited to 2.6 during this period. This was when new archetypes started to grow. The Hog Executioner Tornado was one of the most infamous. The Executioner Tornado combo offered near-perfect defense against swarms and pushes, while the Hog Rider applied constant pressure. Watching competitive players cycle Hog while defending flawlessly with that combo became a defining image of the 2018 and 2019 metas. It was frustrating to play against, but beautiful to watch at the highest level. Another variant that rose to prominence was Hog Freeze. This was the opposite of 2.6's careful chip strategy. Instead, it relied on catching the opponent off guard. You drop the Hog Rider at the bridge, then freeze their defensive building or troops to guarantee tower damage. At the pro level, this deck was seen as more of a gamble, but when it worked, it created some of the most dramatic finishes in Clash Royale. Few things match the hype of a last-second Hog plus freeze push winning a match in front of thousands of viewers. By 2019 and 2020, even more versions appeared like Hog Earthquake, which became a direct response to the rise of buildings such as Bomb Tower. Earthquake gave Hog decks a way to clear buildings quickly, while still getting tower chip damage. It was another reminder that Hog Rider wasn't just a single deck, but a flexible win condition that could adapt to almost any meta. Of course, this adaptability didn't silence the debates around him. Some pros argued that Hog Rider was the fairest win condition in the game because he could always be countered with careful defense. Others insisted that his ability to guarantee chip damage made him inherently unbalanced. The fact that both sides had valid points speaks to how well designed the card was. He was never completely unstoppable, yet never truly weak either. One thing is certain. During these years, Hog Rider became the face of competitive Clash Royale. He was everywhere, from community tournaments to the biggest CRL matches on stage. He wasn't always the star of the show, but he was always present in the background, quietly shaping strategies and dictating how players built their decks. And in a competitive scene that was constantly changing, he offered something rare: stability. Looking back, it's easy to see why Hog Rider remained relevant while other win conditions faded in and out of favor. Golem Night Witch had its time. Three Musketeers had its moment before heavy nerfs. Even Lava Loon went through cycles of dominance and decline, but Hog Rider just kept going. He was never too strong, never too weak, and always useful. That balance is exactly what allowed him to survive through the years and cement his place as a Clash Royale legend. In the end, 2018 to 2020 was a period where Hog Rider didn't just exist in the game, he defined how the game was played at the highest level. If you tuned in to watch a CRL match, you knew there was a good chance you'd see a Hog Rider charging across the bridge. And whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't deny his impact. Hog Rider in Modern Clash Royale 2020-2023. By the time 2020 rolled around, Hog Rider had already proven himself as a timeless win condition, but the modern Clash Royale era brought a whole new set of challenges. This was the age where Supercell released powerful new cards and made some of the most controversial balance changes in the game's history. Somehow through it all, the Hog Rider not only survived, but adapted yet again. That in itself is a testament to how strong the design of this card really is. One of the biggest shifts was the release of the Earthquake spell. At first glance, it seemed like just another addition to the game, but for Hog Rider, it was revolutionary. Hog Earthquake quickly became a dominant archetype because it solved the one problem Hog decks always had: defensive buildings. Bomb Tower, Tesla, and Cannon had been nightmares for Hog players. Suddenly, Earthquake offered a clean way to destroy them while also chipping at the tower. Hog EQ became a staple in ladder and competitive play, and even today, it remains one of the strongest variants. But the Earthquake wasn't the only factor. The rise of Bomb Tower as a defensive powerhouse also forced Hog decks to adjust. Players had to get more creative with cycle patterns and timing. Instead of just spamming Hog at the bridge, smart Hog players learned to outcycle their opponent's Bomb Tower and find those small openings to sneak in tower damage. This is where the skill aspect of Hog Rider really shined. It was no longer enough to drop Hog and hope for hits. You had to think several moves ahead. Another big addition to the game was the Fisherman. On paper, he was one of the worst enemies a Hog Rider could face, since his hook could drag the Hog straight into the middle of the arena, where buildings and troops would tear him apart. Yet even this didn't kill Hog decks. Players found ways to play around the Fisherman by spacing their Hogs correctly or using support cards to block the pull. It showed again how Hog Rider was never truly shut down, he just demanded adaptation. The introduction of champions in 2021 also shook things up. Cards like the Archer Queen and Golden Knight were game changers across the board. Despite all these changes, one thing never changed Hog Rider's popularity. Whether you were a casual player grinding ladder or a pro competing in a tournament, Hog decks remained one of the most common sights in the game. Part of this is because they are simple to understand, yet difficult to master. Anyone can drop a Hog at the bridge, but not everyone can outcycle Bomb Tower, time Earthquake perfectly, and manage Elixir against heavy pushes. That balance of accessibility and skill is what kept Hog Rider alive even as Clash Royale became more complex. By 2023, Hog Rider's reputation was firmly cemented. He wasn't the flashiest card anymore. He wasn't broken or unstoppable, but he was reliable and still capable of defining entire metas when paired with the right support. Many win conditions from the early years had either fallen out of relevance or were only viable in niche decks. Hog Rider, on the other hand, kept charging forward literally and figuratively. Looking at this period, it's clear that Hog Rider's strength was never about raw power. It was about flexibility and resilience. He adapted to earthquakes, he endured fishermen, and he thrived with Archer Queen. Even in the modern game where balance changes can completely erase certain cards. From the meta, the Hog Rider stayed consistent, love him or hate him. You couldn't deny that he was still one of the most important cards in Clash Royale. Legacy and cultural impact. If there is one card in Clash Royale that has managed to carve out a place not just in the game, but in the culture surrounding it, it is the Hog Rider. From the very beginning, the Hog Rider stood out. He was loud, fast, and carried an identity that players immediately recognized. His signature shout, Hog Rider, became a sound that anyone who had touched the game could instantly identify. That voice line alone has echoed across countless streams, YouTube videos, and even memes on social media. It turned the Hog Rider from just another troop into an icon. But beyond his personality, his impact on gameplay is impossible to ignore. The Hog Rider essentially created an entire playstyle around himself. Hog cycle decks became one of the most influential archetypes in Clash Royale history, and they are still relevant to this day. The concept of using a fast win condition supported by cheap cards to cycle quickly reshaped how players thought about the game. It wasn't about building giant unstoppable pushes anymore. Instead, it was about efficiency, timing, and knowing when to pressure your opponent. If you see someone who has mastered a Hog deck, you immediately respect the level of skill it takes to make every single push count. Even in terms of balanced history, the Hog Rider was at the center of attention for years. He was never completely broken, but he was always strong enough that Supercell had to keep a close eye on him. Every slight buff or nerf he received sparked debates across the community. Some players argued he was too oppressive, while others defended him as one of the fairest win conditions because he required skill and prediction. That constant tug of war around his balance is a big part of why he stayed relevant for so long. He wasn't just a card you played, he was a card you had an opinion about. Culturally, the Hog Rider became one of the faces of Clash Royale and even Clash of Clans. His design, his shout, and his pig companion made him a fan favorite. You see him plastered on advertisements, merchandise, and even outside the games themselves. Few cards manage to achieve that level of recognition. It's not an exaggeration to say that when people think of Clash Royale, the first image that comes to mind is often the Hog Rider. What's really interesting is how the Hog Rider crossed the line between frustration and admiration. Every Clash Royale player at some point has raged at a Hog Rider slipping through their defenses and chipping away at their tower. Yet those same players often turn around and use him because of how reliable and versatile he is. That strange love-hate relationship is what cements his legacy. He is both the hero of many victories and the villain of countless defeats. Looking back, the Hog Rider's legacy is simple but powerful. He defined metas, influenced playstyles, and became a cultural symbol for the game. He is not just a card you drop on the battlefield, he is Clash Royale's icon. And that might be the highest honor any card could ever achieve.